For 67 years, the Pope did not live in Rome. Not visiting elsewhere temporarily, not on an extended trip, the actual seat of the papacy relocated entirely to a city in southern France called Avignon, and it stayed there across the reigns of 7 consecutive popes. For an institution whose entire identity is built around Rome, around St. Peter's traditional burial site, and around the city we've spent this whole channel exploring, this is a genuinely strange chapter, one shaped by political pressure, personal ambition, and a slow, difficult process of eventually finding a way back. This video covers how it happened, why it lasted as long as it did, and how it finally ended. Welcome to Pope Pulse. This continues our deeper dive into Catholic Church history. If you missed the last video on how the papacy itself began, that's worth watching first for context. But this one stands on its own too. The story begins with growing tension between the papacy and the French monarchy in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Pope Boniface VIII clashed repeatedly with King Philip IV of France over a range of issues, including taxation of church property within French territory and broader questions about whether royal or papal authority took precedence in various disputes. This conflict escalated dramatically, culminating in French forces actually seizing Boniface in an incident in 1303, and the Pope died shortly afterward, reportedly never fully recovering from the shock and physical mistreatment of that event. The next Pope, Benedict XI, reigned only briefly before his own death. Then, in 1305, French cardinals succeeded in securing the election of a French-born pope, Clement V, a choice widely understood at the time as reflecting significant French political influence over the selection process. Clement, for a combination of political and personal reasons, chose not to relocate to Rome at all following his election. Instead, in 1309, he settled the papal court in Avignon, a city that, while not technically part of the Kingdom of France at that specific moment, sat close enough to French territory and French influence that the arrangement was widely understood as placing the papacy under substantially greater French sway than it had experienced under previous Rome-based popes. Avignon wasn't a random choice. The city offered genuine practical advantages that made it an attractive, if controversial, alternative to Rome during this particular period. Rome itself, by the early 14th century, was in a genuinely difficult political and physical state, plagued by ongoing conflict between powerful local noble families competing for control of the city, general civic instability, and a level of physical decay in parts of the city that made it a considerably less secure and less comfortable base of operations than it had been in earlier, more stable centuries. Avignon, by comparison, offered a more stable, more secure environment, along with easier access to France's wealth and political support, at a moment when the papacy genuinely needed a stronger patron given its recent conflicts with Rome's own turbulent local politics. There was also a practical geographic logic. Avignon's location provided reasonably convenient access to the wider European continent for diplomatic purposes, arguably more centrally located for engaging various European powers than Rome's more peripheral position on the Italian peninsula was at the time. What began as an apparently temporary, practical solution to a difficult set of circumstances gradually became something considerably more permanent than anyone likely expected at the outset. Following Clement V, 6 additional popes reigned successively from Avignon: John the 22nd, Benedict XII, Clement VI, Innocent VI, Urban V, and finally Gregory XI. Across these 7 pontificates, spanning from 1309 to 1377, the papal court in Avignon developed into a genuinely substantial, well-established institution in its own right, extensive administrative buildings, a significant permanent bureaucracy, and considerable investment in what eventually became the Palais des Papes, an enormous fortified palace complex that still stands in Avignon today as one of the largest surviving medieval Gothic palaces anywhere in Europe. This period is sometimes referred to historically as the Babylonian Captivity of the papacy, a deliberately provocative label drawing a comparison to the ancient biblical exile of the Israelites in Babylon, the implication being that the papacy, too, was being held away from its rightful home under circumstances at least partly beyond its own control. Critics at the time, and many historians since, have generally viewed the extended Avignon period as damaging to the papacy's broader credibility and independence, given the widespread perception across much of Europe that French political interests held disproportionate influence over the papal court throughout this entire era. Several Avignon-era popes did make efforts to eventually return to Rome, recognizing the reputational cost of the prolonged absence, but various combinations of political instability back in Italy, the practical comfort and security of the by-then well-established Avignon court, and simple institutional inertia repeatedly delayed any actual permanent return for decades. One especially notable figure in finally ending this period was Catherine of Siena, an Italian mystic and later canonized saint, who became a passionate, persistent advocate for the Pope's return to Rome. She corresponded directly and repeatedly with Pope Gregory XI, urging him in strong terms to relocate the papacy back to its traditional home, framing the extended absence as a genuine spiritual and institutional problem the Church needed to correct. Catherine's advocacy is generally considered one of several significant factors that finally influenced Gregory XI's decision to return the papal court to Rome in 1377, ending the 67-year Avignon period at last. It's worth noting historians generally view her influence as one contributing factor among several broader political and practical pressures at play during this period, rather than the single decisive cause on its own. But her role remains a genuinely significant, well-documented piece of how this era finally came to a close. Catherine of Siena's involvement in this specific episode later became part of the broader reasoning behind her eventual canonization as a saint, and centuries later, she was named a Doctor of the Church, a formal title recognizing especially significant contributions to Catholic theology and church history, making her direct role in ending the Avignon Papacy a genuinely notable chapter within a much longer, celebrated life. Ending the Avignon period, unfortunately, did not immediately restore stability. Gregory XI died just 1 year after returning to Rome in 1378, and the resulting conclave elected an Italian Pope, Urban VI, a choice that quickly proved deeply controversial among many of the French cardinals who had grown accustomed to Avignon and to greater French influence over papal affairs. Dissatisfied French cardinals soon declared Urban's election invalid and elected a rival pope of their own, who took up residence back in Avignon, effectively splitting the Western Church into two competing papal claims simultaneously, one based in Rome, one based in Avignon. This crisis, known historically as the Western Schism, which we've referenced briefly in earlier videos in our conclave series, dragged on for decades, at points even producing a third simultaneous claimant, and wasn't fully resolved until the Council of Constance in the early 15th century finally secured a single, universally recognized pope once again. In a genuinely important sense, then, the Avignon Papacy's legacy extends well beyond its own 67 years. The political and institutional tensions it created directly set the stage for an even messier, longer crisis that followed almost immediately after it formally ended. Stepping back, the Avignon period offers a genuinely useful lesson about the relationship between the papacy and political power more broadly, a theme that shows up repeatedly across Catholic Church history whenever we look closely at any given era. It demonstrates that even an institution built around claims of unbroken continuity and unique, divinely guided authority has, at multiple points across its history, been genuinely vulnerable to the political pressures and practical circumstances of its specific historical moment. The papacy's eventual return to Rome, and the corrective reforms that gradually followed the resolution of the subsequent Western Schism, reflect a recurring pattern we've touched on elsewhere in this series. The Church repeatedly encountering genuine institutional crises and gradually, sometimes painfully slowly, developing new safeguards specifically designed to prevent similar problems from recurring in the future. It's also a useful reminder that Vatican history isn't a single, smooth, uninterrupted story. It includes genuinely turbulent, contested periods where the outcome of major disputes was far from obvious to the people actually living through them at the time. So that's the story of the 67 years the papacy spent away from Rome, a move driven by very real political pressure, sustained by genuine institutional comfort and inertia once established, and finally reversed through a combination of determined personal advocacy and broader political necessity, only to immediately collide with an even messier crisis that followed right on its heels. If you're enjoying this deeper dive into Catholic Church history, subscribe to Pope Pulse for more, and let me know in the comments. Had you heard of the Avignon Papacy before this video, or was this new information?